Welcome to Season 2 of the Thoughts with Lakshman podcast. My name is Lakshman Sybil. I'm a rising senior at the Edgemont Junior Senior High School. Well, I'm really finishing up junior. I'm not a senior yet, technically. But yeah, welcome to Season 2. As you know, first of all, I want to thank everybody because Season 1 was very successful. We had over 350 listens, which I didn't think we'd have. 350 listens is very impressive for I don't have any sponsors or anything. I'm not marketing this at all. So the fact that just putting this out on the platform, so I was able to get 350 listens, I'm really appreciative of that. And I'm glad that I was able to, people were interested in it. I originally planned on doing this to try and help people out with COVID because I know how difficult it was for people in hospitals when they were stuck in hospitals for COVID related issues or other things, but they were in hospitals and they were all isolated from their family. And they were completely, they were just stuck on screens all day. And their rates of depression were so high and their mental health wasn't very good. And they were just stuck on screens. And I wanted to try and give them a productive activity. So that's why I created the podcast. One, I really enjoy doing it. I do a lot of reading and research in my free time anyway. So this really wasn't, adding. It was just me, taking my research and reading and just now being a little bit more organized with it. That's all I really had to do, and try and construct that into episodes. But I'm glad, I was able to partner with local hospitals, specifically really the Mount Vernon Hospital is really successful with them. Also the local Westchester Hospital too, and the White Plains Hospital. And they did a great job sharing the content. So I'm really appreciative for them. But we're going to continue. At first, this was really COVID focused, but I'm continuing this. I really enjoy making the podcast. I was a little busy. I had, some standardized tests. I had, AP exams and my ACT that I had to knock out of the way. And I've also been working on a research project, um, which is really cool. It's about spree-walled pickles. One of the episodes in our podcast in season 1 discusses this. I'll quickly go over this, but you can take a look at that episode too. It's one of the first ones because I wanted to start with that too because it was one of my favorite topics. But East German nostalgia is a fascinating concept. And by the way, apologies for the mic. I don't have my regular microphone. I spilled something on it, so if the audio isn't as good, I'm sorry. I'll try my best. But East German nostalgia is fascinating because under the GDR, life wasn't really that great for East Germans. Under Stalinist totalitarianism, they didn't have any political freedom. They suffered a lot. That's why there was a brain drain. And for people who had family members in West Germany, they couldn't see them for years. They look so different. There's a beautiful book. It's not even a book. It's a short collection of poems that discusses, how people reacted to seeing their family members look so different. It's almost like when people go to space, right? And they come back there for 3 years. Well, it was a little longer, but similar thing happened with East Germans. But still, East Germans had this profound connection to certain products and goods that were produced by the GDR, and they kind of they found solace in them. They truly found solace in those products. And one of my favorite ones was Spreewald gherkin, or Spreewald pickles, as they're known in English, um, because these little pickles were able to unite East Germans. And one of the other things too is after the Berlin Wall, after unification, and I'm spending a lot of time on this. I want to get into our topic today, but this is really interesting. But after unification, there was a big inferiority complex between East Germans and, West Germans felt superior. All of lots of aspects of West German culture kind of, ran over East German culture. And understandably so, right? You would expect that. Lots of West German businesses were more efficient, they were run well, and you would expect that. But there was also a bit of a fight back because not East Germans, acknowledged that they were aware of that, but they were like also, not everything we have is bad, and they did like a few things, and they've grown accustomed to, they've grown attached to, and one of those things was Spreewell pickles, And after the Berlin Wall came down, the company that produced there are multiple companies that produced them, but the most famous one is just called Spreewald Deutsch, I think. And they went under. They couldn't compete. They would not. They didn't survive in the free market. And the West German companies that try to replicate that and try to produce Spreewald pickles themselves to sell because there was high demand for it, they couldn't get the taste right, according to East Germans. And that's fascinating too. You can read about that, how they still think that the taste isn't the same. That's a topic I found super interesting, right? And also, if you watch Goodbye Lenin, which is a great movie, it's Goodbye Lenin. I encourage you to watch it. It's basically focusing on that. Lenin is a younger boy. I think he's a college student in the movie, and he favors unification. He's against the East German communists. His mother, on the other hand, is far more. She's fine with the communists, and Lenin's attending this political protest. His mother is sick. His mother goes in a coma, and when she comes out of coma, East Germany and West Germany become united, right? And the Berlin Wall comes down. She doesn't support that. So the movie goes into all how they kind of, after her mother comes out of coma, to prevent her from going into coma again, the efforts that they go to make it seem to her mother that they're still divided. So they cover up the windows, they make their own TV shows for her. But one of the things they do with food, right, is her mother loved Spreewald pickles, and they couldn't find Spreewald pickles because her mother wanted to eat Spreewald pickles. They couldn't find Spreewald pickles after unification, so that's another thing that kind of focuses on that. But that's a truly interesting topic. I go into greater detail in season one, but I really want to try and improve the quality and the length of these podcasts because I think I could have done a little better. I was also learning. It's the first time I've ever done this, but maybe I revisit that topic again because it's just so fascinating. You can talk about it for so long. Um, but today, I want to talk about a new topic. And I think I'm going to do a series on this because what I found from really the best criticism I got, and I'm really glad that I did get criticism because you can only grow from criticism. You can't grow from compliments are great. I love the compliments, but criticism was very valuable to me. And I feel like I could have done a better job going deeper into specific topics rather than covering a lot of topics. So that's something I'm really going to try and focus on um, now in season two. So one thing I'm going to start. So a terrific book I've been reading. So Jan Uselman, he's a professor at Georgia Tech University with German. I think he graduated from the University of Texas. And I don't think he's doing as much work with the universities. He does a lot of work with also German University. Georgia Tech is a terrific program, study abroad program, and he does a lot of work with the German university. I forget the name that they send kids to from Georgia Tech, but he goes back and forth between them. But I was lucky enough to speak to him for over an hour, and his research is fascinating. He has one of the most interesting topics, probably the second most interesting topic to me, relating to German history and German culture behind Spreewald pickles. And that's after post World War II and the formation of German democracy. Um, so just to give you some backstory, right? Germany's history is fascinating. Even if you've never studied German, you've never taken any German history classes, you know a lot about German history just taking American history because of World War One and World War Two. So with Mr. Usman's project, and he has a book. I'm going to talk about it. I was lucky enough to get the book, um, and it's a terrific book. I read it once. I'm reading it again too. But what happened with uh, with Germany after World War II? They lost World War II, right? The U.S. played a major role, and maybe I could do a podcast on that. I discussed a little bit of World War II in one podcast. Maybe I dive deeper into it. But for now, let's just focus on this. Let's not get distracted. So after Germany lost World War II, right? And Nuremberg trials, lots of Hitler obviously killed himself. Although there are conspiracy theories that say that Hitler didn't kill himself and went to South America. There isn't any proof, but there are some conspiracy theories there. But though a lot of Nazis did flee Germany and instead of getting tried in Nuremberg trials, they went to South America. So that's interesting. Actually, we could do a topic on that because there's proof of that. There isn't proof that Hitler was one of them, and these people weren't as high profile. But what's interesting, what Mr. Uzelman focused on in his book's called "Staging West German Democracy: Governmental PR Films and the Democratic Imaginary," from 1953 to 1963. It has an orange cover, in case you're interested in buying it. What's fascinating about his research, and just to give you a better backstory, so World War II, they lost. Germany lost. Nuremberg trials, lots of Nazis were tried. Very few. The only ones that really didn't get punished were the ones who weren't as high ranking. They really went after them, and that's one thing Germany's gotten a lot of praise for educating on that. You know, if you go to school in Germany, German textbooks aren't going to ignore World War II and Hitler. They're going to spend a lot of time talking about that. If you go to China, or not China, China's still not great about it. China likes to, they'll present, for example, Tiananmen Square. They'll present that differently, but really North Korea is, if you go to school in North Korea, it's fascinating, which some journalists have been able to obtain. So Germany they've definitely, been forthcoming on that. But after World War II, the Nazi propagandist, not propaganda was crucial to Hitler's rise and the Nazis becoming popular in Germany. Crucial. And there are a lot of elements at play, right? After World War One, Germany was struggling. Um, Sanctions on Germany were too harsh by the U.S. and the Allies, and that was a big mistake that they made. That was one of the biggest mistakes in history, and that kind of gave rise to Hitler, right? There was so much economic struggle, and that led to political uproar. That's kind of why, you see with the Truman Doctrine, which was 400 million for Greece and Turkey, the Marshall Plan, right? That's crucial economic aid. Why did the U.S. do that? Well, they did that because if someone did that to Germany, Hitler wouldn't have happened, right? So they didn't want that to happen after World War II. But back to Germany, and that's interesting too. The Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine, that's very, very interesting too. I wrote a research paper about that this year, and it was one of my favorite papers I wrote. But back to Germany, um, propaganda was so important for Hitler, for the Nazis, and they had lots of. I would argue, I don't really know if I'm well researched, but from what I know, I think German propaganda at this time in the world may have been the best in the world. It may have been the best in the world, and it was very effective at persuading the public. And this propaganda, there were so many Nazis that were experts at this propaganda that once Germany lost World War II, right? Once they lost and once the Nazis were tried, they actually didn't try certain Nazi propaganda experts. They didn't try these Nazi filmmakers, and they made a deal with them. The post World War II German government, they made a deal with them, and the Allied powers knew about this too. They made a deal that these Nazi filmmakers would continue making their propaganda films, except for the other side. So instead of arguing, pushing forth the Nazi message, well, now they're going to make these Nazis are going to make these propaganda films, but instead of pushing for the Nazi message, it's for democracy, and it's fascinating, right? I mean, imagine how the difference is stark, right? And they did it because they would have gone to jail, they would have died, so they had no choice. They were happy to do it for their freedom, and they did a good job with it. That's the most interesting thing, and that's what the book explores. They did a terrific job with it, and it really helped. And that's really the fascinating thing because it's really difficult to quantify that. Like, how are you supposed to quantify the effectiveness of a movie, right, in persuading the German public? But what Mr. Usman does very well in his book, he looks at a lot of documents. He put in multiple years. I spoke to him about this. I was very lucky to speak to him. It was not scheduled or anything. I was signed up for a Georgia Tech German information session, and just so happened he was there. And we spoke about the Georgia Tech German department, but we also spoke about his book. That's what interested me more. And then we exchanged emails. We had another conversation. But he looked at polls, for example. There were a lot of polls done before and after movies out. Those were very effective. And the films are really, because remember, you're living in a different time. Okay, you're mid 20th century. This is what you're dealing with right now. People listen to this stuff. People believed it. People listened to it. They trusted it. They didn't doubt it, and that's what made them so effective. And they were effective for the Nazis. They were effective, I would argue, even more so for German democracy, because the public had to, instead of, they were pushed so far in one direction, they had to turn around the full circle, or not full circle. They had to go the other way, right? And that's really, so I'm going to go through this right now, and I'm going to go through the book. This is kind of what the series I want to do. I really want to spend some time talking about this book, and exploring this topic, because what I think is a lot more interesting is, instead of touching up on broad topics, which I think is important that we did in season one, I really want to dive deep into a couple things in season two that really interest me. And whether that's going through a couple books, discussing some parts that I found particularly interesting, or I think that's probably what I'm going to end up doing. But also with movies. So if you do want to watch these films, by the way, I'm going to see if I can attach a link at the end of this podcast to the website I found. Now the problem is there are some copyright problems with it. The link I found was a little dodgy, and also they're only in German. The movies, I don't think you can even translate it, which is fine. I mean, if I assume if you're listening to this podcast, you have some interest in German culture, so you probably know German as a language. If you don't, that's okay. You can still tell what's going on, but it'll definitely be more difficult to follow along. I'll see if I can find English versions of the films, but from what I've seen, it's remarkable that they're even online in the first place. Um, but yeah, so let's. Who was the federal chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany after World War II? That was Konrad Adenauer. And that's someone you should know too. Um, Adenauer is very, very important. One of his interesting paintings is Christ as Man of Sorrows. This is unrelated to the Oh, I should have spoken about this. So they're propaganda films. There's also artwork. There's also paintings. And that's pretty consistent. If you look at history, even if you look at current day North Korea, if you ever seen a North Korean rally, you'll see Kim Jong Un painted in like a diamond shape, and they're all marching. Same happened with Stalin. Same happened with Mao. Same happened. So but it's interesting you're seeing this on the other side of things, right? For German democracy. But Christ as Man of Sorrows is a very famous painting that tried to portray Adenauer as kind of kind of gentle, kind of loving, kind of like a more, and also godly too in a way, but a little bit more relatable in a way. Also remember, these are government commissioned films, right? These aren't private films. That's another topic. That's another thing to keep in mind. And there's a lot of symbolism, right? There's a lot of symbolism in these films. That's another thing I want to touch on. It's fascinating the way they do this, and I can't really be as specific right now as I would like to, because I'm trying to figure out how I can explain it. But the specificity, it seems very basic in terms of the symbolism. I mean, having Christ as Man of Sorrows, portrayed as Jesus Christ. There are other pictures where in movies, for example, or in films, they're called. A great example of this is Neue Deutsche Wochenschau and Welt im Bild. And both of these films are really focused on foreign policy. Okay, and you can really present foreign policy through a film. You can make it look very different than what's actually going on. Um, and the public can't see what's actually going on, right? Reporters at this time, there wasn't as advanced media in Germany, and there's a podcast episode in season one. It's another topic I would really like to explore more deeply is media, German media over time. But they couldn't really tell what's going on in those closed door meetings. So you could really manipulate, right? Like you could really present the German government in a completely different way with foreign policy meetings through these PR films. For example, a man advocates for his people. This is another one I want to talk about. So this one is probably the most. There are two that are the most famous in my opinion, from what I've read. One is a man advocates for his people. Ein Mann wirbt für sein Volk. That's pretty self-explanatory from the title. That's again presenting Adenauer as a patriot, loves his Germans, loves his fellow Germans, would only do the best for them, is always considering them in all his actions. That's kind of what that's portraying him as. The other very famous one is The Path into the Future, Der Weg in Zukunft, which is a funny word, but Der Weg in die Zukunft. The path into the future is interesting because remember you have a democratic Germany, right? In this stage, there are elections, right? Now, and that's another thing we could explore is the validity of those elections, because there's some interesting things with German elections back then, but they were largely democratic, right? That's what they were, and by making PR films like The Path into the Future, right? That's pretty powerful for voters, right? That's really powerful for voters. I mean, it sounds really basic now because we see this stuff all the time, right? We see political ads all the time, and we just take it as it is. We don't give much thought to it. But for people in the mid 20th century, when they're seeing a full movie that's made on this, really high quality, and they don't have that many movies to watch, by the way. It's not like, you know, they're choosing to watch a government commissioned movie about, the path into the future under Adenauer and German democracy over some, entertaining movie. They don't have much choice at this time. They're entertained by this stuff, right? These movies aren't made that often. When they're made, they're going to watch them. So that really affects them. Movies like this, especially with how they're going to vote. And it is what it is, right? Propaganda is always going to exist. Propaganda exists today, right? But that's pretty powerful. That film. The interesting thing about the PR films is that you can tell from the films, like you can tell the date of the films without watching the films, even though the films don't reference very many like specific things in a way. The films tend to be more broad. They tend to be more focus more on symbolism, focus more on just presenting the German democratic government as being very well. German democratic government. I didn't want to accidentally say the German Democratic Republic, right? Because that's very different. But presenting this new democratic government in a very strong light, as knowing what they're doing. That's kind of how the films are. They're not really diving deep into a few things. They're not very that specific. So you can tell through the PR films by watching them. And I've seen this too. When I watch the films, I watched three of them, and I couldn't. There was somewhere I struggled a little with the German because this is also 20th century German. My speaking and listening skills. I'm a much better writer and reader at German, and I think most people who are English speakers will probably start off like that. I'm trying to make an effort to try and talk German. I'm doing a program where I'm talking with German for 2 hours basically every day for the next 8 weeks, which is pretty cool. We had a lot of fun with that today, actually. But that's how I'm trying to improve my speaking with German. But listening to the movie, I couldn't follow along with that much of it. But what I could tell, I could follow enough that I could tell that the third movie A man advocates for his people. That was the last one. That was the last one. And the reason I could tell that is because the tone was more, it was almost as if the filmmakers had sensed that the public were growing to favor democracy. The first one was more, um, it definitely tried to address the skepticism, right? It definitely, they focused a lot on, first of all, they focused a lot on the previous government, right? They focused a lot on the Nazis, and they tried to draw a contrast between, well, the Nazi government, and they tried to portray World War II and how they struggled so badly. And they used that to really try and um, gain credibility for the democratic government. Even because, remember, for the German people, the democratic government at the time, they didn't have much of a track record, right, for the German people to judge them off and trust them. So the way that they almost, that the filmmakers kind of got the support for that without a track record is by comparing the German democratic government to the previous Nazi government, and really focusing on the failures of the Nazi government. So that was very effective. And you can tell as the different stages, right, just by watching the film, right, that when it was made. And that, I think that's very interesting too. And I'm not just focusing on, because someone could say, well, that's so basic, right? If a film's black and white, I can tell it was made back then. If a film's in color, there's a lot more complicated than that, because they're all black and white more or less. They're within a 5 to 7 year span, and it shows the development of German democracy. That's what I think. But let's move on. Um, Another interesting thing are, what are the motivations and the strategies, right? With how the filmmakers tried to present, the new post-war democratic government in Germany as a flourishing democracy. One of the things they really did, and this was a little risky, they really tried to align themselves with, through the films, they tried to align themselves with Western powers, right, like the U.S. Because the German people didn't particularly like the U.S. at this time in the mid 20th century. They didn't like France. They didn't like Britain. They liked the U.S. Well, the German democratic government, the post-war government, they're aligned, right? I mean, they're um, pretty aligned. The German representatives in that government, they're definitely aligned um, with those Western powers. I mean, they're literally controlling the government. So the way that those films did that, because that was one of the hardest, hurdles to jump over, right? How do you get the public to go from hating the Americans, hating the Brits, hating the French, to now start, accepting them, accept this new relationship that our government has? That's difficult. That's really, really difficult. And the way they were able to do it, they really tackled it head on. Head on. They tackled it head on. Um, and they tried to, one of the things, and you can talk about freedom of media and the evolution of the German media. The big things that really influenced people were newspapers and movies. Okay, and whatever they could see. Movies were rare, but they were cool, right? People really remembered what they saw in movies because they couldn't see them that often. They were fascinated by them, so and they were more trusting of them because they were rare. And they also trusted their newspapers. Newspapers weren't as rare. I mean, they're not to the scale they are today, but they weren't as rare. But they were more accustomed to their newspapers. And there were definitely German owned, government owned media agencies that the people read and they followed. They did a great job of convincing the people, to become more accepting of the relationship with the U.S. So that's another fascinating topic, right? Freedom of the press is beautiful. Freedom of the press is necessary in a healthy democracy. The press should be able to criticize, um, everyone without any ramifications. They should be able to criticize the president, criticize senators or representatives. They should criticize anyone without ramifications. That's crucial. On the other hand, right, you're seeing in Germany, well, if they were so critical, if you had a free press in Germany, would democracy have grown to be as successful as it was? Would public support would have been there? Right? That's an interesting question because I completely support the freedom of the press. I'm a firm believer in the freedom of the press, and I think like I said, it's so necessary. But that's a weird historical question, right? That like in this certain situation, freedom of the press probably wouldn't have been beneficial here, right? Because democracy was what was needed, but it wouldn't have helped if you had totalitarianist um, or communist newspapers that the public loved, and they were listening to them, and they started. That wouldn't have helped, right? That would not have helped the efforts for democracy. And democracy is very important. I mean, obviously, it's very important. So that's really interesting. That's another thing that I wanted to touch on because there are lots of, especially in German history, from what I've studied, there are lots of these like uh, backwards-ish situations where like you'd expect one thing, but like the backwards way of doing it kind of makes it better in a way. Like if that makes sense. Maybe not backwards, but like it's unexpected, extremely unexpected, right? And this is unexpected that not having freedom of the press in this stage, and there was freedom of the press, but there were just a lot of German-owned media companies, and they were spreading this propaganda. They were spreading certain news. So then the public over time became more supportive of the relationship between the U.S. and Britain and France. Um, and the other thing too, which we should, Mr. Yosman deserves a lot of credit, is that his novel really was the first novel that really did comprehensive research that focused on the West German government's efforts to create support for democracy through films, through media, and so that's another thing I wanted to mention because this is a terrific study, and I know we're not as specific as we could. I want to try and focus on another couple more topics. Oh, another thing, Adenauer is the redeemer of the Germans, right? Redeemer of the Germans. That's pretty familiar. If you've studied World War One, you studied German history. You know who was redeemer of the Germans? Hitler. Hitler was the redeemer of the Germans, right? The Germans, that's what they felt. That was one of their, I don't know if the exact wording was that, and I'll take a look at the German words for this. But after World War One, right, Hitler was viewed as a loyal person for Germany. He's going to stand up for us. We got, destroyed by the World War One. Then we got even more destroyed by the Treaty of Versailles and our sanctions. And Hitler's going to be the one that helps us, and he's going to stand up for us Germans. That's how they viewed him. They viewed him as almost like a redeemer of the Germans. So it's fascinating, right? That for Adenauer, for democracy, that they're using a very similar kind of campaign style. I mean, you see that in American politics too, right? Reagan's slogan was "Make America Great Again," and Trump stole it from him. Um, so the people steal things like that, but it's particularly interesting because it's Hitler, right? I mean, why would you steal something from Hitler? That's not necessarily someone Adenauer really wants to be making comparison to, but he was fine with it because it worked. It related to the Germans and it worked for them, which so that's interesting too. Um, that you because you would definitely would not expect that. And by the way, the films were also present not just in Germany, but Austria, Switzerland, but also in Britain and France. That shouldn't be completely underlooked. And just another quick thing. Adenauer's political party was the CDU, or the Christian Democratic Union. So that's another thing. And the films weren't just for Adenauer or Germany as a whole. They were also more specific films for their government, for representatives, but it wasn't just for one because they weren't made so often. But it would be for, elections to help out a lot of people. So that's another thing. But they were heavily tied to the CDU party um, at this time. And the films are very well made, very very well made, um, and they really linked Eisenhower with the new democratic government successful path towards a politically stable, um, democracy, um, and by doing that, they gave Adenauer a lot of credit. Adenauer is a central figure here. He's a central figure because the films. It's really easy if you think about it. I don't know if it's easier if it's easy, but I certainly think it's easier to focus on one person in a film than to focus on a country as a whole or a government as a whole. I think that's really because the symbolism you can do, you can really project that person in a positive way, especially because this is the mid 20th century. Okay, the media isn't as good. There's German-owned media companies. They're not going to criticize Eisenhower, and then the other media companies, well, they don't have the capability to criticize him in a serious way, and they weren't as popular as the German-owned media companies. It wasn't like the people were paying much attention to them anyways. So it was really easy for them to, I don't know if they had approval ratings at the time, but with these films, with the media, I mean, I don't know how his approval rating must have been through the roof. Um, and it's easier for them to do that with Adenauer than it would have been for them to do that with the entire German government. And that's what kind of why they struggled in the beginning with getting support for the new relationship with the U.S. Um, and Britain and France. But really, the films represented Eisenhower, the chancellor, to portray his politics so that they were likable, so that they were understandable. He wasn't. They didn't portray him as some. Though they did actually. Never mind. They did have some paintings that portrayed him as a godlike figure. But there was a lot of stuff that focused on him being a relatable, likable person. Also, that's interesting too, because remember, context, mid 20th century in Europe. Is relatable, likable really that common across Europe? Not really. There's a lot of royalty. There's a lot of aristocracy. That's you know that's interesting too. We covered the propaganda. They're obviously propaganda. They're made by the German government. Um, they're filming Adenauer on his trips, like we said, right, with favorably covering him with political and foreign policy, not political, but foreign policy discussions. Hmm. And just to before we finish up, well, yeah, but I wanted to keep it around. So 40 minutes is good. Okay, so yeah, that really brings us to a good natural end. Sorry that the end. I covered everything I had on my notepad, and then I was looking through the book itself. So I'm trying to find something. Well, I'm going to look for it right now. Um, so I really wanted to introduce this topic. We dived a little bit into it, but I want to go a lot deeper, right? Like I think we're at the level where we don't need um, like a full on gas tank, like a water tank. We're just closing our nose. We're jumping into the water. We're gonna stand there for. We're that deep, right? I want to go deeper so that like we need a water tank to come out. That's how I really want to go into this. So I'm gonna spend more time um, preparing. I have a lot of ideas for this, but I just need to make sure it's a little bit more organized. But thank you for listening to the podcast. I hope you're interested in this topic. We're gonna do a series on this. Um, so I would maybe the next 4 or 5 episodes are covering the formation of West German democracy using Nazi filmmakers propaganda because I think that's so fascinating. I'm going to be referencing the book a little, referencing some research papers that I found particularly interesting. Um, Nothing's too specific. I'm just, just the theme of it, just some eye-opening things. And I'm also going to try and see if I can find a link to an English version of the films for the next podcast, because I think that would be helpful. Because I know the majority of my listeners are English, or native English speakers, or beginner German speakers, or more advanced German speakers too, actually. But I think that would be very interesting. But like I said, thank you for listening to the podcast. Remember, the podcast is available on Apple Music, on Spotify, not Apple Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, everywhere basically. The Anchor app is tremendous for me. It really helps me out to put it out there. Subscribe, give it a great rating if you enjoyed it, and I'm going to have fun. We're going to have fun together, and we're going to dive deep into West German democracy, the origins of West German democracy. So thank you for listening, and goodbye, or tschüss.